The other day on the podcast, we were talking about, we talk about crime on the podcast all the time because I just think it's such a disastrous state right now. But my friend Dave Ross, who I used to work with him at Cairo News Radio in Seattle, he's a longtime legendary radio host in Seattle, even made a brief foray, he ran for politics once. He had a commentary on crime that I didn't necessarily agree with. I'll play a portion of that for you.
Seattle's per capita murder rate isn't even in the top 10, or the top 20, or the top 50. It's 77th. 3.74 killings per 100,000 people each year, about the same as Portland or Riverside, California, or surprisingly, New York City. Atlanta's murder rate is 4 times that today. So I'm still glad we moved here. So why does it feel like crime is out of control? Because there's a political campaign on. A lot of the ads are focused on crime, and fear works.
So I invited Dave Ross to come on the show for Fridays with Friends to talk about what's going on with crime in this country and in cities like Seattle, but also just to talk a little bit about his just amazing career in talk radio. The Dave Ross, welcome to Fridays with Friends.
Thank you.
It has been a long time since I've seen you in person, although I listen to the show still. How many years have you been at Cairo News Radio now?
44.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
44.
I had the same reaction when I found out.
Have you put thought into how much longer?
Yes, I have put thought into how much longer. Some years ago, I started a file folder which has the tab Life After Radio, and it's empty. So that's what's kept me working for so long. I can't figure out anything more interesting than what I'm doing.
Well, I heard a rumor about you, and I want to know if it's a true rumor. Do you park at the top of the stairs by the studio still?
Before my heart surgery, yes, I did. Since then, they've given me a parking space across the street from the station. But for years, I've, like anybody in Seattle, I've been in search of free parking. And we're right next to I-5, and there's that Colonnade Park under the freeway, and behind that, on I think it's Lakeview Avenue, is this undiscovered strip of the city hasn't discovered there's free parking there yet, is all I can figure. And since I get there at 4:30 in the morning, it's always empty. So I parked up there for years until others found out about it. But no, since then, they have finally given me a spot across the street. So.
See, what I heard, and maybe it's not true, is that because these stairs are, it has to be 200 stairs?
No, 116 steps.
116. What I heard is that you parked up there because the day you couldn't walk back to your car, you were going to quit your radio job. Is there any truth to that?
That's actually not a bad way to do it. No, sometimes I would walk up the stairs, and sometimes I walk up the second flight, which takes all the way up to Capitol Hill, mostly for exercise. So I've learned that the only way I can do exercise, because I find it so boring, is to force myself to do it. So number one, it was free parking, and number two, it forced me to walk 116 steps 5 days a week, and here I am.
Yeah, you're in great shape, so maybe 116 stairs a day isn't a bad idea.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've really, and I filled in for Dory Monson the other day, and I was telling people that they shouldn't just listen to Dory's show if they only listen to his show, because one of the things that I like about Cairo News Radio is you can listen at different times of the day and get just totally different opinions. But I compared you on the air the other day to Bill Maher, and I want to know if you're offended by this or if you think it's fair. So my argument is, and why I listen to your show, even though we disagree on some stuff politically, is because I feel like you're always willing to call balls and strikes, even if it's against, the political side you might more closely associate with. And I feel like Bill Maher has been good at that lately. So what's your approach, I guess, on the show to trying to deal with the political climate that we're in?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Bill Maher swears. I do not swear. On the political climate, I have throughout my career wanted to find solutions to things. I admit that it's fun to debate sometimes, but most debates go in circles and it changes nobody's mind, and more importantly, nothing changes on the ground. So when I decide to do a commentary on an issue, usually it's focused on trying to solve the problem. What I've learned over the years is that many times it's not in a politician's interest to solve the problem, because once you do that, what do you fundraise on, right? It takes fear to raise money, And nobody votes for a guy who says, vote for me, I'll represent you, and I'm nice. No, it's vote for me because if you vote for the other guy, America will fall into the sea. So there's just no motivation for actually solving the problems. That's what my approach has been. I will tell you, it's a difficult approach to market in the commercial environment of talk radio because, again, it doesn't have the same kind of excitement and thrill of stomping your opponent. But that's what makes the job fun to me, and that's what's kept me going for 44 years is because the job is fun. Otherwise, I'd have been gone long ago.
You're talking about your empty folder saying life after radio, some people will remember that you ran for Congress in
Yes.
2004. Have you contemplated politics at
No,
all?
no, I'm too old to run now. If I were elected to Congress now, I would never get any seniority, and I'd just be watching other people have all the fun. But I will say it was an excellent experience because it helped me be a little more sympathetic towards politicians than I had been before.
How so?
Well, because I understand why they censor themselves. I understand why they never say anything. The politicians who talk the most in public are the ones, in my experience, who get the least done. You have guys like, I guess Sherrod Brown was one that I thought was a workhorse and not a show horse. They work in the background. They're focused on solutions. There are a number of, what is it called? The Problem Solvers Caucus? I forget what they're calling themselves these days. It's a bipartisan.
I think it is
bipartisan
the
group.
Problem Solvers
Yeah,
Caucus still.
yeah, who are mostly people you've never heard of, and they apparently get together, and they leave it to the other guys to push the Democratic and Republican brands in public, while they're in the back room slaving away at language that will actually solve the problem. And I guess crossing their fingers they can still get reelected. But that was the group of people that I would probably have affiliated myself with. Whether that would have gotten me reelected, I don't know. What I do know is that they warned me that if you win, the next day we'll be having you making 5 hours of fundraising calls each afternoon. So I don't know. I guess losing might have been not as bad as I felt at the time.
Well, it was a different political climate back then. I mean, in so many ways, but even the 8th Congressional District was more firmly in Republican hands, and that's changed a little bit over the years, obviously. You ran as a Democrat. Do you still consider yourself a member of the Democratic Party?
Well, I never signed up to be a member of the Democratic Party, so I'm definitely more in sympathy with Democrats these days, only because of frankly, the quality of the people running. A lot of people, anytime a Republican allies themselves with Donald Trump, it discredits them because I believe he betrayed the country. I could say more, but I won't.
Well, I mean, that's what I believe too. So you can say all you want about that. I've been very clear, and it's interesting. You talked about it's hard to market when you're not firmly in one camp, and even in Seattle, although I might fall towards the right in Seattle, I still consider myself a moderate independent, and I've been very harsh on the former president. And there'll be times where I'll do a segment and lose hundreds of subscribers that day over a Donald Trump
You're
segment.
in a really difficult environment because even though if I say something that people hate, it doesn't affect my salary. And you're out there in the Wild West, Brandi.
Yeah, it's fun though, and you just have to commit yourself to it and realize that, and I told people when we launched the podcast, you're going to hate what I say half the time, and you've got to be able to live with that, or it's just not going to be the podcast for you. Speaking of, I'm going to agree with people half the time, you had a couple commentaries lately that I've had strong opinions on. One of them was the hire back ferry workers who were fired over the vaccine mandate. Yeah. Now, is that just because you rely on the ferries? Is it a selfish position?
I find most of my commentaries, you got to write what you know, right? So I take the ferries a lot because I have a hideaway on Vashon Island. So about once a week, you'll find me on a ferry somewhere. And I've gotten to know a few ferry workers over the years. They're great people. I know it can be a mind-numbing job sometimes, but they're also essential. I mean, it's required by the Coast Guard for safety reasons. And I didn't understand the reason why, especially when we were having staff shortages like this. You would fire perfectly healthy people because they felt they could stay healthy without taking the vaccine. It made no sense to me, especially now. I mean, I cut Jay Inslee, the politician, some slack because in the early days, we have to remember, this was the the illness from hell. It was a mystery illness. Nobody knew how to fight it. And the best medical experts I could talk to, and I talk to a doctor every week for our show, is that there's no vaccination against coronaviruses. Absolutely unheard of. But now we managed to come up with one. I haven't had a cold now, not even a regular, ordinary cold, in 2.5 years, which is really weird. So I mean, it looks like we actually licked that. Back then, they didn't know that. Well, now that we've fixed it, I don't understand why you wouldn't say, okay, that was what we thought at the time, that we had to be really hard-nosed about vaccination. But now you have staff shortages, you have runs being canceled, the schedule cut back, and at the same time, experienced people out there who could fill those jobs. Why not just say, okay, we're sorry, please come back. You're already trained. Come back.
Why do you think that the governor has not been willing to go that far, or his agencies?
I guess he's worried that a bunch of Republicans would say, I told you so. And they would, but so what? Again, it's about solving the problem, right? So if they say, told you so, that's life.
Yeah, and I'd feel much differently. I mean, I got vaccinated, but when I, still got COVID, I was like, I'm not going to get boosted. At least I haven't yet. And I would feel much differently about the vaccine mandate if it was highly effective in stopping transmission. I do realize that, it can keep you from dying, but I would have felt much differently about it. But when we realized you could still get and give it, I was sort of like, okay, maybe we don't fire cops and firefighters and ferry workers. It doesn't make an awful lot of sense. You said you gave Governor Inslee leeway at the beginning, and I did too. I was sort of like, let's just do what needs to be done. I think it was this really unknown situation. What do you think of the governor's, kind of lengthy emergency powers, which are, he's giving it up in like 16 days. Does that bother you, the fact that he's kept his state of emergency going?
I've listened to some of the commentary on that he's trying to be a dictator. I think that's ridiculous. I think part of the emergency power thing is apparently a formality to allow them to move money around. I was happy that they avoided a recession, although we're apparently going to pay for it next year. Now, it's the fact of a governor declaring emergency powers itself doesn't bother me. Firing people who didn't need to be fired is what bothers me more than that. You should have the right not to get vaccinated if you don't want to. It's also true that we were slow to realize that it wasn't the disease wasn't as dangerous to children as we thought in the beginning. But again, being a grandparent and knowing how my daughter feels about her young child, she's going to get that kid vaccinated because even if it's like a 2% chance of a kid dying from COVID, no parent wants to take that chance. Those are precious lives. So basically, yeah, I believe give people a choice. I think if you compare us to other states, we were pretty successful at avoiding some of the worst case scenarios that were being predicted for COVID. But now that it seems to be under control, like I say, it's time to move on. Vaccine amnesty, hire them back. Get some of the cops back too, for God's sake.
My argument against what the governor was doing in this sort of unilateral power wasn't really about Jay Inslee per se. It was like, why don't we have the legislature be able to sign off on a continued state of emergency?
It becomes inevitably political, as it did. I mean, the whole debate over emergency powers is political. It's over the oppressive Jay Inslee, which I just think is ridiculous.
Well, you got Democrats in control, though, so presumably they'd just sign off on it anyway.
Well, I guess, but I don't think you make policy because of and hope that the status quo is going to stay there forever. I mean, things will switch, and we know that these emergencies are used for political purposes. And I admit that's putting a lot of trust in one man. But let's remember, and I hate to go back to the founders, but they realized that somebody's got to be in charge. There's got to be an executive.
Let's talk about crime, because you did another commentary that I half agreed with, and then for half of it I was screaming at the radio, and then I agreed with you again at the end. But just generally speaking, like you said, you've been in Seattle for a long time. In the commentary you talked about living in Atlanta, for instance. Characterize the state of Seattle in your opinion. Give us your honest assessment from a public safety standpoint.
I feel safe going into downtown Seattle in the daytime. I feel safe going to Seattle Center at night. I'll be going there tonight to a show. I would not go to a bar and stay until 2 a.m. But I'll tell you, Brandon, that's not because of the current situation. I've never gone to a bar and stayed until 2 a.m. Uh, Nothing good. What do my parents say? Nothing good ever happens after midnight out in public. So, but I also have. I go to the Pike Place Market area like 3 times a week. That's where my gym is, and sometimes I'll wander up to Third and Fourth Avenue to check it out. And it's depressing compared to what it was. But I have to put that in perspective, not just because of my experience in Atlanta, whereas I mentioned the commentator, I was a police reporter, was, for a year or so, we went out at every murder. Um, but I also remember what Seattle looked like when I first got here in 1978. I used to take I couldn't afford a parking space or, to drive downtown. So I took the bus and I get off at Westlake. Westlake was, for the center of a city, it was the most depressing looking city center I had ever seen. I walked to work to the old Cairo building either along 3rd or 4th Avenues. Back in the day, Fourth Avenue between downtown and the Seattle Center was a wasteland of aging, decrepit buildings, flop houses, et cetera, the places where people who now live in tents would have lived before, right? And you were accosted by panhandlers. The whole was about a mile walk, and I would keep little dollar bills in my pocket, so I say, here for you, here for you, here for you, as I passed the panhandlers. So that was Seattle State back then. There were people hanging around the Missions in Pioneer Square, et cetera, et cetera. Seattle is vastly, vastly improved since then. It's got a real downtown. It can compete with any other big city in America. And at its height, right before the pandemic, I would walk past the Amazon building. They had food trucks out there. They were making yogurt for the employees. Everybody was, eating outside. It was great. The pandemic killed that. And talking to the Downtown Seattle Association, occupancy downtown is like 40%. That's why it looks so morose, because you find when the office workers are down there, when the cruise ships are in town, there are still homeless people there. There's always going to be homeless people there no matter what you do. That's just the way societies work. But it feels a lot better when you're surrounded by, 80% of the people who look like you and have a place to go and have jobs, and you don't feel insecure. On a gloomy day when there are no cruise ships in town and you've only got 40% occupancy and nobody's outside, who's going to still be out there? The people who have no place else to go. And then you assume all of Seattle has no place to go. No, not true. It's a vibrant city. I'm lucky to have moved here, and it just discourages me that so many people are down on it.
Yeah, and the kind of closing point you make is we can't abandon downtown, because if we abandon downtown and then, it's taken over by the ne'er-do-wells or whatever, and I agree with that sentiment. I was just downtown the other day. I mean, I'm willing to go downtown, but I think one of the issues I take, and it's actually, I did a commentary a couple years ago admonishing former Chief Carmen Best and former Mayor Jenny Durkin for this. We just had that shooting down at the McDonald's where some innocent people, including a little boy, were shot. And they have this press conference and they come out and say, well, actually, crime numbers are down from their peak, like in the 90s or whatever. And it's like, well, we don't care what our crime numbers are.
Exactly.
We want to know what you're doing. And so when people point to the 80s or the 90s, it's like, I wasn't even alive, and I certainly wasn't in Seattle. And then when people say, well, crime is not bad in Seattle compared to the murder rate in Atlanta or Chicago, it's like, well, I don't live in Atlanta or Chicago. I live in Seattle, and all I've known is Seattle for the past 13 years, and it's been on this steady decline. And so isn't it okay to, regardless of the numbers, to want to feel safe in the city that you're at, relatively speaking?
Yeah, I generally don't like using statistics because, like you say, statistics don't apply to your own case. And of course, if you're the victim of assault, the crime rate might as well be 100% for you, right? All I know is that the antidote to crime is creating a feeling of security, and so there's a number of ways to do that. More cops on the beat. One thing I like about New York City, and I grew up in the suburbs of New York, and we're going with my dad a number of times. And he teaches you, if you're traveling, always stand with your suitcase between your legs. Keep your wallet in a zipper pocket. Don't go down dark streets. I mean, that's just the way you behave in a big city. Um, you can put cops on the streets, and that's what New York does. You walk down the street in New York, there's always a cop somewhere in view. Should be the same in downtown Seattle. Walking, I mean, bikes are nice, I guess. Cars, I don't feel secure because a cop car drives by. I want to see a cop walking up and down the street. And the second is putting on public events. That's what the Downtown Seattle Association does. We used to have concerts. I once conducted the Seattle Symphony at Freeway Park. You have events that draw people out and get a lot of working people walking around. It's good exercise for them, and it makes everybody feel safe. And that's what they've got to do. And I think that's what the DSA is trying to do with their ambassador program. Also, you keep it clean. You paint over the graffiti. And this is a thing that really bugs me. I've never liked that retaining wall along I-5. It's like a scar through Seattle. But it's even worse when it's covered with graffiti. But trying to get them to put artificial ivy on it, because the graffiti artists hate walls with ivy. They won't touch them. And if you're not going to do that, then go out there with a giant spray paint truck every night and spray over it until the graffiti artists are so frustrated they give up and find something productive to do with their evening.
Yeah, I do agree with the graffiti sentiment, the trash sentiment. So what would your advice be to, say, Amazon? Amazon could make a huge difference if it opted to have all of its employees come back and revitalize downtown. But then I look at some of the things that have happened. They had the Amazon engineer who was her head bashed in with a baseball bat by a random guy. You had just the other day, the rideshare driver shot in the back of the head outside the Spheres. And so I know from Amazon's perspective, there's been a hesitancy given the state of things, but it's sort of like, if you bring your workers back, things would get better, but you're worried to bring your workers back. So I guess if you had Amazon's ear, what would your advice be to them?
Well, I would say figure out what it takes. You got some dough there at Amazon. Figure out what it takes to make workers feel secure. I mean, hire your own security people. If you choose, you're in the news business, any given day, we have the resources to broadcast every crime in America and scare the hell out of people. There are some really nasty characters out there. But you go back in history and, we've had axe murderers, we've had serial killers. We are mortal human beings, and we still have those animal instincts, and some people have things wrong with their brain that makes them do brutal things. That's all terrible, and they should be punished if we can't figure out a way to reprogram their brains. But we're Americans, Brandi, we don't surrender. And that's what I'm worried that people have decided to surrender. And now that a lot of them can work from home, there's no reason ever to leave the house. I just think that's a boring way to live. I worked from home. I worked from this room for 2.5 years. And it was great in the beginning because I could just walk downstairs and go to work. But I'm talking to little figures in a screen. That's just no way to live. It's so much better to get back into the office and be with Chris and Colleen and the crew and feel like you're part of a team instead of phoning in from your hideaway.
Yeah. I know I've kept you just way too long, so I'll wrap up by saying, and yeah, I agree that I hope people can bring themselves to keep the city alive, but I can't tell anybody, disregard your safety if you don't feel safe.
Of course not. If you don't feel safe, stay home.
Right.
But I'm saying, give it a chance. There were people sitting at home in Florida who ended up drowning. Life is full of risks. If you look at what kills people, it's bathtubs and stairs, and those are right there in your home.
Yeah. We'll end with this. What's going to happen in November? November 8th, what party is going to control Congress?
No idea. And I don't care. I just hope that the votes are not overturned by somebody. I just hope that we trust the count, that it's all secure, that we all agree that it's a secure election. Frankly, Brandi, I'm so worried about the election process itself. As long as it results in a decision accepted by everybody, then I have no problem with who controls Congress.
If you've not become a subscriber to Undivided already, there are 2 ways you can do that, and it's as little as $5 a month. So if you think that what we're doing is important, if you find value in it, if you appreciate what we're doing to hold elected leaders accountable and to look at things through the lens of common sense, I would appreciate it if you'd become a paid subscriber to the show. That's how we're funded. This is a people-powered podcast, And you can do it for just $5 a month at patreon.com/undivided. That's patreon.com/undivided. Or you can become a contributor on my locals community, brandykruse.locals.com. Undivided is presented by our founding sponsor, 1530 Mortgage. Visit them at 1530mortgage.com.